I've been in fora today where there have been some very good discussions about what the creative university would look like. But of course, if you're talking about the creative university, you can't talk about one model, because it is always a process of reimagining. It is if you take the concept of the imagination, then the university is always in the process of reimagining itself. And that is a philosophical and reflexive activity. So we might see some radically different kinds of models. And I think that's good, because in an industrial age, one of the problems with universities is that they have become so homogenized, so much a kind of world model of the university. And when you see how it operates, you read the strategic plan, the mission statement, they all have the same scriptwriter. They mention the same terms. And so you have this sterile approach based on strategic planning and other forms of managerialism, really, which impoverishes the notion of the university and doesn't admit the kind of institutional diversity that we should be encouraging people to experiment with. Thank you so much, Susanna. Very nice to see you again. And to be back in Marburg to see Suzanne Weber, both sources of inextinguishable energy. This conference is an example. I always say the great professor can be judged by the quality of the relationship they have to their students, and here one sees plenty of evidence of that. So congratulations to you both. You have such a great group of supporters and students and colleagues, junior colleagues, some of whom I've had an opportunity to talk to. And that's a great reflection of you, but also part of a new kind of model of collective creativity that we're here to talk about today. And I must say, I wondered how I should begin this, because I've heard so many good, inspiring comments and addresses in the forum, and I wanted to capture some of those. And I was also privy to hear the way in which many of the speakers included reference to other presentations that they'd heard. And to me, that was a kind of like a living embodiment of meta-textual commentary, like, the history of the footnote. Here you had a citation, an acknowledgement, which is the basis, really, of peer review, of peer learning, and which is the basis of the critical university. So, the performance here is something in a face-to-face environment, which I think embraces those modern principles to do with peer review. And when we talk about peer review, I'm thinking about one of the first journals, the one journal that is the oldest in continuous production, which is the Royal Transactions of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, established in 1665 with one editor, Henry Oldenburg, who wrote everything for the journal. And you go back to the online archive, and you see in this journal a record of the transit of Venus, some vivisection of some kind of animal, a series of mathematical equations all thrown in the same journal. And the concept of peer review actually doesn't get invented for another 100 years. And it's not the Royal Society in London, but it is, in fact, the Edinburgh Royal Society in 1732. So the concept of peer review is actually, while the basis of our collegiality,
is very recent. And I think it's also something that we need now to embrace as the basis for a new paradigm of creativity. And thinking about this and listening to Ron Barnett and Peter Murphy and Amanda Bill and Suzanne Weber and a whole bunch of other people, I wondered to myself, how could I encapsulate the argument that I'm going to present? Because I have a very long paper and I have so many slides, and I thought really what I need to do is to use a blackboard, but in this very distinguished room, there is no blackboard. So I had to ask to get some brown paper and use a marker pen. And really, I'm going to summarize this here because I use the trope from Peter Murphy, the end of the paradigm of individual creativity. Now, I'm not saying the end. When I say the end, I mean the end of its dominance, right? And I'm suggesting that we are moving to the beginning of a paradigm of social creativity. That shift in the discourse, but also in the institution, in reality. And I'm suggesting that the sources for this paradigm of individual creativity comes to us in large measure from two sources: Romanticism on the one hand and German idealism on the other. And these here, both in literature, represent a counter-enlightenment movement against the mass society, against the rigors of a methodological science, against industrialization. They focus on the heroic individual of genius who is not in charge of a series of dark, inchoate forces that express themselves in the artistic creation. And that artistic creation very often is something that emerges after a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of torture, self-torture. And so we have the literary equivalent of that, both, I think, in the English context and also in the German context here. I'm thinking about a lovely book that Ron and I discussed quite recently, Isaiah Berlin's Roots of Romanticism, which I think is a terrific book that provides some kind of capture of that concept. And that heroic individual of genius is not only in philosophy and poetry, in art, but also it's invented in the Schumpeterian entrepreneur, the heroic individual that takes those risks. Schumpeter is a romantic. He comes out of the romantic tradition. You see the same forces at work here. And I'm suggesting we're moving to a paradigm of social creativity here, and the concept that I really want to say is the root concept here is a notion of social practice, the notion of practice, and in a Marxian sense, but also in a sense that I would want to recruit the services of Wittgenstein and Heidegger to talk about linguistic social practices, to talk about being in the house of language, I guess, and that what I'm trying to move to is a concept of creative labour that might invest our future institutions with some kind of concept of creativity. Not yet here, the birth of this notion, the creative institution, what might it look like? Well, as its basis, I would say it has the notion of creative labour. And the creative labour, for me, flows out of this practice dimension. And it has three levels, as I've thought about it to myself: a social labour dimension, a social production dimension, and a social media dimension. And I think that gives me the resources to talk about a theory of collaboration. co-laboration. Co-labor. So I'm going to start up this machine here and run through some slides. That's the argument. That's the discursive shift. That's the, let me say, without being too dogmatic about it, this is the narrative that I would like to play with, to suggest the merest outlines of. And of course, in 1 hour lecture, that is quite a lot to cover. So, in relation to this area of creative labour, I want to talk about the concept of radical openness. So that's the title here, Radical Openness, Creative Institutions, Creative Labour, and the new logic really for organisations under the regime of cognitive capitalism. So let me see if I've got this right. I start, because I'm in Marburg with a homage to Heidegger's Marburg, because he spent his teaching career here from 23 to 28. He met with the distinguished theologians, Bultmann, Hartmann, so on. And really he began to forge the question of being through an engagement with Aristotle, and developed a notion that stressed both historicity and the concrete existence of Dasein as being in the world. And the notion of the concept of open is one of the names of being and of world. And I'm using the Italian philosopher Agamben here, who in a beautiful paper traces Heidegger's genealogy of the concept as it originates in Rilke's Duina Elegy, quoting the open in which every being is freed is being itself. So while Rilke privileges the animal that sees the open as a man, as opposed to a man who looks backward, Heidegger reverses the hierarchy to embrace, quote, the open as the name of what philosophy has been thought of as aletheia, that is, the unconcealedness of being. So I'm working with this concept of openness and being from this Marburg philosopher who spent his time here. And I should really mention Hannah Arendt and all those wonderful women theologians who have their portrait hung in the galleries around the porticos here. All women. The first professor of pedagogy here, a woman professor, I believe. I have to justify ethically my choices here on Heidegger, and I feel in this environment a little on the back foot. But for Heidegger, quote, only man can see the open which names the unconcealedness of being. And so he draws on Heidegger, this is Agamben, draws on Heidegger as an inspiration, ultimately to explore the way in which Western thought has defined man as an unstable signifier that hovers between animality on the one hand and human being on the other. And his reading draws us closer to the ontic political theme of the open considered in its political and organisational forms. So we can come back to that, and I have a reading of, I'm trying to write a paper on Agamben and Heidegger, but I won't go there at the moment. I'm happy to talk, to discuss those ideas with people who are interested. So the relationship between creative labour and creative institutions, that's my topic, especially the logic of openness for reconstituting the public sphere, public organisations. And the talk has really kind of 6 pillars to it. Openness and creativity. Creativity is the new development paradigm. The concept of radical openness. Eventually I get to that concept. I've mentioned it once. Cognitive capitalism, creative labour, the new logic of the public sphere, and this notion of co-laboration, from co-production to co-creation. So let's start with digital openness and the openness of digital systems. I don't know whether I need to say too much here. I'm certainly not going to read these slides out. But, I mean, here, one of the things we can see is the way in which these new digital logics are creating open cultures. we might say even user-generated open cultures, which become a necessity for systems as a whole, the design of open, progressive technological improvements with their political, epistemic, and ontological foundations. And these new digital logics have the capacity to alter the organisation of knowledge, not only knowledge but also education and culture. This is the organisational imperative for the beginning of the new paradigm that I'm suggesting, which favours the networked peer community. Well, this is not a shattering truth. I know everybody engages this as a practice on a kind of daily basis. But we might say that it is a kind of a liberal political economy, digital economy, with this shift to network media cultures, which is based on a concept of free speech anchored in kind of Western tradition here as a significant personal, psychological, educational good that is dependent on promoting self-expression and creativity, essential to political democracy, and which includes notions of digital rights and the reconstitution of public space. So we might also say this is a kind of neural openness as well, network neural openness. Now, I don't know whether you know about the Blue Brain European project, which is, or BAM, which is the Brain Activity Map, which is again, here in a time of recession, both of these projects, one American, one European, have billions of dollars devoted to them to map the neural networks of the human brain, but also to look at parallels to organic computing, to look at the modelling of one on the other. So let's have a look at then, I'm skating through these very quickly. Creativity is the new development paradigm, and I think that people have made the point that we are talking about a politics of creativity here. We can't leave out the notion of politics here that rests on a kind of an intersection between art and labour in the form of a co-production, a co-creativity, a peer collaboration within this new mode of social production. So maybe we can say globalization is connectivity rather than economic integration or the doctrine of free trade. This comes from the United Nations Creative Economy report. They've made two reports now. One was in 2008 and the second one is in 2010. They're adopting creativity as the new development paradigm. Well, what do you do when the West, in its imperialism, has prescribed the development model for underdeveloped countries, and now we find ourselves the axis of Western capitalism, America and Europe faltering under the combined weight of finance capitalism. And many of the countries, the BRIC countries, growing at rates that the West has never experienced, or only experienced in its very early industrial phase. I'm just going to give you I guess you can read this. Let me say, a new development paradigm is emerging. This is UN. That links the economy and culture, embracing the economic, cultural, technological, and social aspects of development at both the macro and the micro levels. Central to this new paradigm is the fact that creativity, knowledge, and access to information are increasingly recognised as powerful engines of driving economic growth and promoting the development of globalisation. I'm not going to read the rest of it, blah, blah, blah. The United Nations came to it quite late in the process, 2008, 2010. They're jumping on the bandwagon here, it's a great report. But then when I thought the creative economy, universities figure in this, education is central in this, but they are both absent from the UN report. Sadly, I think it's a great mistake in my view. So the creative energy of labour, I want to come back to this as a manifesto for education in the age of cognitive capitalism that must address the question of new labouring subjectivities, their cultivation, socialisation and education. I think we need to understand better the creative energy of collective forms of networked labour that's globally distributed. So that's in my view, that's the underlying beginnings of this paradigm that I sketched here. And of course, distributed knowledge systems are extremely important here. You know, we've heard this before, the integrated cross borders of distributed knowledge and learning systems, which now stand outside the purview of the state. They are in some kind of global third space. Let's call that a new global public space that's emerging. And these systems, I think, represent a new stage of development characterised by a fundamental sociality. I go back here to the relationship between these three thinkers in relation to the concept of social practice. Knowledge and the value of knowledge, I would argue, going back to these thinkers, is rooted in social relations. So, the concept of radical, I'm going to skip over these. These are some forms of works that I've been involved when a recent one came out this year, The Pedagogy of the Open Society, and the most recent, which is came out a couple of months ago, Education, Science and Knowledge, Capitalism, Creativity and the Promise of Openness. I'm not going to dwell on those, but we already have a concept of open knowledge economy. I've got some examples here. Jimmy Wales's Wikipedia, Abelson's Lessig and the founders of the Creative Commons, Michel Bowens and the members of the P2P, Peer-to-Peer Foundation, Rufus Pollock and the members of the Open Knowledge Foundation. You know, those are five major ones. I'm saying there are many, many more. I could give you a list. So OKE, the open knowledge economy, I suggest offers a way of reclaiming knowledge as a global public good, of viewing openness as an essential aspect of an emerging global economy, commons, that fosters both open science and open education. I want to say something more about both of those topics. But the Creative Commons here, this is the statement from the Creative Commons. You know, this is the attempt to provide a mission statement, if you like, for Creative Commons. Develop, supports and standard stewards legal and technical infrastructure that maximises digital creativity, sharing and innovation. That's their byline. Here's the P2P Foundation. It suggests peer-to-peer technology, among other things, quote, creates a new public domain, an information commons which should be protected and extended, especially in the domain of common knowledge creation. And this domain, where the costs of reproducing knowledge is near zero, requires fundamental changes in the intellectual property regime. The Open Knowledge Foundation, they say, we are a global movement to open up knowledge around the world and use it usefully, bring together a diverse community, building a network of individuals and organised around key principles. Well, this is interesting because the Royal Society that I started off by mentioning here have recently published, only a couple of months ago, a report called Science as an Open Enterprise. And here they say, Science as an Open Enterprise report highlights the need to grapple with the huge deluge of data created by modern technologies, petabytes, in order to preserve the principle of openness and to exploit data in ways that have potential to create a second open science revolution. Now, I think this is really kind of interesting because here is a bunch of quite conservative scientists in the Royal Society that are not given they're not given to making claims that they can't substantiate. And here, this is a kind of messianic statement, really, in a way. And they've come to it quite late, because it was only a few months old, this report. And also, I can't help but criticise them for the informationalism that lurks, the ideology of informationalism that lurks in the statement of science as an open enterprise. Because for them, it is a problem of handling large amounts of information. So they don't address the political and the ethical questions to do with openness. I hope I'm allowed to make that criticism. And of course, you know TED Talks. TED Talks. TED does talk. Here's TED Global 2012, their recent conference last year in Edinburgh starts with this opening. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected and open, radically open, manifesting itself in open borders, open cultures, open source, open data, open science, open world, open minds, openness. With the loss of privacy that implies, openness carries its own dangers, but it breeds transparency, authenticity, creativity, collaboration. All bets are off as to what openness and collaboration in an ultra-connected world will mean for human potential. And it goes on to, you can read the rest of that for yourself. I'm hoping you can see that from the down the back. Is that, yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so, and I love that video. Here's a young video maker who's talking about the concept of radical openness with such enthusiasm. And but it is, let me say, it is a very American view in a way, because it's very technologically driven. It's about what's possible in terms of technology. And the ethical side and the political side kind of drop out of this concept. So my task in the remaining little while that I have is to try to build those components back into the concept of radical openness. He says, you have this interesting thing happening where biology is this emergent phenomena that builds upon its own complexity. It leads to emergence of consciousness, but then consciousness wants to free itself from the constraints that biology sets forth. So even through biology, though biology causes consciousness, it also burdens it. Well, I think he's right, actually. I think that he's absolutely right. And I think that one can provide some kind of argument, serious argument, for that proposition. But here's Don Tapscott, who also uses the concept. I thought I had invented this concept, but I find that Don Tapscott has used it as well to talk about the changed way that the rules of the game for business have been changed through globalization. Today's organizations, he said, are held to stringent and fluctuating sets of standards by unrelenting webs of stakeholders, and what's becoming an ultra-transparent world, every misstep is subject to scrutiny in every country with a brand or reputation to protect as vulnerable. So we have the Radical Openness Workshop in 2011, Open Innovation, Designed for the Loss of Control, Openness in Organizations. And here are the topics: crowdsourcing, open design research, open strategy, open source software, open source social networks, open branding, openness, social capital, open conversations, blah. Open conference. It's an unconference. Well, also, Bell Hooks, who wrote about radical openness back in 2003. I stand closer to Bell Hooks, I might say, here, where she urges a kind of radical openness in teaching and learning as an essence of education, as a practice of freedom, considered both as a spiritual and mental activity. So let me move through quickly here to provide a context, the Italian discourse on cognitive capitalism as a context for creative labour. And, this draws on cognitive capitalism, sometimes referred to as third capitalism, after mercantilism and industrial capitalism, is caused on socio-economic transformations, caused by internet and Web 2 technologies that have transformed the mode of relation, the mode of production, and the nature of labour. So this is Antonio Negri, but also a whole bunch of Italian thinkers, economists, political economists, who have written about this concept, I think, focusing on the question of digital or immaterial labour. What does it mean? And with a Turkish fellow, a student of mine at Illinois, Ergun Bulut, we put together a book called Cognitive Capitalism, Education and Digital Labour, for which Antonio Negri allowed us to use a piece of his to talk about the notion of digital labour under and here are some other books that are around this book with Simon Margis and Peter Murphy. I want to really talk about knowledge economy in three ways, three different forms of knowledge economy here, which has a very different view each has a very different view of creative labour. I call it the learning economy on the one hand. It's an OECD sort of concept. The creative economy, which represents new formations in the post-industrial society. You know, it's the emphasis on invention and ideas rather than the production of tangible goods. And then the third one, which I'm going to focus on here, which is openness and freedom of expression is essential to knowledge economy. And I want to talk about these forms of open knowledge production. We can see this new mode here, distributed knowledge, open learning, open education, sometimes OER, open educational resources, user-generated cultures, open science economy, openness in the reconstitution of the public sphere. So in some sense, it's not an equation, an exact equating of openness and publicness, but there are, let me say, new logics of collective action which allow for new forms of knowledge organisation, and they also require new forms of thinking here, particularly in this very dense and overlapping social media landscape. And I think in this environment we have to talk about open institutions, but also the corollary of that, which is open management and open governance. Open governance. And of course, in each of these, we have a history. If you want to talk about open governance, go back to the literature on open government, that occurred in the 1960s. And now we have, I think, the number of countries that have legislation on their books that talks about the Official Information Act, the ability of the citizen to be able to recover state files that are kept on the individual. They have that right. That is part of the Official Information Act. That's an Official Secrets Act. It is an attempt to guard against the state collecting secret information on individual citizens. So there's a whole set of international legislation, international law, but also country law based on those notions. But also, I think I can provide you with some references to this very interesting literature. But open management also based on open meetings, disclosures, freedom of information, budgetary review, and so on. I think the text that Negri uses here and others, the general intellect, which informs really kind of notion of social practice here. I'm not going to. It's a little bit late in the day to spend too much time on this, but I do have some slides that begins to talk about the characteristics of cognitive capitalism as a global economic system and as an emerging one, which is based on the immaterial or the virtual economy, the informatization or digitization of production, with its increasing formalisation, mathematisation, digitisation of language, of communication, of knowledge. And I think also that one might begin to look at the properties of these emergent and distributed knowledge systems. I'm going to focus on one or two of them, but here a dynamic relationship between the material and the immaterial sector, the digitisation and the systematisation of value, rather than value change, where implicit knowledge, living activity, intelligence represents the core of a new commonwealth and the core of a new kind of exchange value. Co-production, just-in-time production allows production only of what has already been sold. The network, the concept of the network. I mean, I've got a few slides here. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but I want to focus on the private appropriation of public knowledge goods and the need for state agencies and international law to gather, to examine the question of monopolisation of knowledge on the one hand and the privatisation of education on the other. I think in particular here, let me focus on this creativity of digital labour, because we are talking now about networks of immaterial labour based on mass participation and collaboration rather than the traditional Smithian division of labour, the move from non-linear dynamical systems of labour, and the internationalisation of these forms of collaboration, learning economies that reinforce forms of collective intelligence as a source of value in the market, creative learning economies which emphasise right brain ascendancy with the accent on the psychology of openness, metacognition and learning by doing. And I have another couple of slides here which I really find it's going to be a bit difficult to cover all of this ground, but you see it is a new paradigm here. Let me focus on the emergence of a new political economy of peer production based on cooperation and collaboration rather than, they call this interneting, rather than competition. Increasing importance of post-human network knowledge and practices based on mega databases and global portals. And the way in which individual performance in these systems is replaced by global performance extended to a team, a territory, a local governance, a whole society of a country, new federations, confederations of states, where these traditional divisions between labour and capital are beginning to be blurred. And we have this decline in standard forms of employment related to the flexibility and the precariousness of production, but increasingly to a constitutional crisis of the salary system. What is labour activity in these new conditions? So let me finish, and I've got a couple of minutes. I think we started a wee bit late. What I would regard as elements of a theory of collaboration. I say, firstly, a move from co-production to co-creation. This is the way in which now we move to social networks that make change. Co-production, a means of developing public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals, people using their services and their neighbours, a mutual reciprocal partnership being used to organise and design social systems. Co-creation, a broad term with a range of applications. Co-creation, any act of collective creativity experienced jointly between two or more people. I think user creation. So here, I think I'm not going to dwell on that. Related forms of collective intelligence, crowdsourcing, distributed thinking, flash mob, hive mind, open innovation. And of course, I think probably more importantly here, a fundamental aspect of this, which goes back a long way and has a literature, theory of the commons, the theory of the commons. And I'm speaking here from Ostrom's work in particular. Scholars working the field of the commons since the mid-1980s have helped forge a substantial transdisciplinary approach to the study of an important type of social ecological system. we could go on, we could spend quite a lot of time on unpicking the theory of the commons, Personalisation, also here a very kind of important element that decenters the state and all forms of central authority. And I'm going to use Paul Feyerabend's term in a new configuration of epistemological anarchy. That notion of epistemological anarchy is an element for me here, and this is Paul Feyerabend writing on epistemological anarchy. He says the hallmark of political anarchism is its opposition to established order of things, to the state, to its institutions, the ideologies that support and glorify these institutions. The established order must be destroyed so that human spontaneity can come to the fore and exercise its right of freely initiating action, of freely choosing what it thinks is best. So here, Paul Feyerabend's work, I think, is quite inspiring in this respect. The way in which our institutional forms are resistant to change. And, he says that it really differs from both skepticism and political anarchism. So he really comes back to the avant-garde, the Dadaists. He says, like the Dadaist, whom he resembles much more than he resembles the political anarchist, he not only has no program, he is against all programs, though he will on occasions be the most vociferous defender of the status quo or of his opponents. To be a true Dadaist, one must also be an anti-Dadaist. So I think that kind of anarchy, that kind of activity, that very, let me say, in the same sense you would talk about Jeffersonian anarchy is that regionalization, that kind of decentralization that takes place within digital systems. And I end the presentation here with anarchy within open systems and a quote from Deleuze. I hope you'll forgive me for just reading this last paragraph here, but this is Deleuze talking on 1,000 Plateaus. He says, there is today in the sciences or in logic the beginnings of a new theory of systems said to be open, systems founded on the interactions that refuse linear causation and transform the notion of time. What Guattari and I call the rhizome is precisely the case of the open system. I return to the question, what is philosophy? For the response to this question should be very simple indeed. Everyone knows that philosophy deals with concepts. A system is a set of concepts, an open system. That happens only when concepts are referenced to circumstances or events and no longer to essences. Yet concepts are not ready-made givens and have no pre-existence. One needs to invent them. One needs to create them. And there is as much creation and invention in this as there is in art or in science. I think I've just saved by the bell here, so thank you very much.